Hey guys, this is Ankita from English Test Solution. Today we're going to talk about question 3 of the TOEFL speaking section. So we're going to cover the structure of question number 3. We're going to then go through an example together so that you know exactly how to solve this question. I'm going to give you a template that you can follow to respond. Then I'm going to give you time breakdown so that you know exactly how much time you need to spend on each part of this question. Then I have actually responded to this question, so we're going to listen to my audio and we're going to see how I use the template and yet manage to sound really natural. I'm going to then give you additional tips for question number 3, and then we're going to discuss what will get you a 26 plus on the TOEFL speaking section, especially if you need this score in order to get your professional license in the US. So first, let's start by talking about the general structure of TOEFL speaking. So as you might know that starting August 2019, there are only 4 tasks on this section. There's one independent question, which is your question number 1, and there are 3 integrated tasks, which is question 2 to question number 4. Then the independent task is the one that requires you to express your opinion on a topic and there is no reading or listening given to you. Question number 2 to question number 4 are your integrated tasks, and they're called integrated tasks because the word integrated itself means combine. So they're asking you to combine the information from the various sources such as reading and listening. So today we're going to talk about question 3. So let's look at what happens in question number 3. In question number 3, you're given a reading passage which basically talks about a term or a concept, or it will explain a process, and it is usually from an academic text. Then you will listen to a lecture where a professor will explain that term or concept and give you examples. Now you're going to get your question and it will ask you to combine and convey important information from the reading passage and the lecture. You will be given 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to respond. Now we're going to actually see the question and do it together, because you can watch as many YouTube videos you want, but if you don't practice along with the videos, you're not going to get the maximum use of the video and your time. So I encourage you to get your pen and paper and let's do this question together. So this is the question I picked for today. It has a heading. Your reading passage will always have a heading, and then you're given 50 seconds to read this. So we're going to read this together because I want to teach you side by side on what are some of the important things. So the heading says cognitive dissonance. Individuals sometimes experience a contradiction between their actions and their beliefs, between what they're doing and what they believe they should be doing. These contradictions can cause a kind of mental discomfort known as cognitive dissonance. So this is great because we know from our experience and what I told you before that usually the question is going to ask you about that term or the concept. Now that term or the concept is here in the heading called cognitive dissonance, and here when we read these 3 lines we find out that this is what cognitive dissonance is. So at this point you should stop and take down the meaning of cognitive dissonance in your notes. Okay, so I'm actually going to look at my notes here. So what I did, I said cognitive dissonance, mental discomfort between, I said action, then I made an arrow and said beliefs. Okay, so you just have to write down something that will help you recollect later on that what is cognitive dissonance. Now let's continue reading after taking the notes. People experiencing cognitive dissonance often do not want to change the way they are acting, so they resolve the contradictory situation in another way. They change their interpretation of the situation in a way that minimizes the contradiction between what they're doing and what they should be doing. So this is something that your first kind of priority should be understanding it rather than noting it down. So first just understand what it means, okay? That people who experience cognitive dissonance, they don't change the way they're acting, but they resolve this kind of contradiction, which is cognitive dissonance, by changing how they interpret that situation. Okay, so this is good to understand. Now, if you have time left in 50 seconds, you can write words. So something in your notes that will help you recollect. So I wrote change interpretation, decrease contradiction. So they change their interpretation of the situation by and decrease their contradiction. That's all. And then your 50 seconds will be up. Okay, so in order of priority, first, obviously, write down in your notes about the main term, because later on in your introduction you would have to explain what this term means. So write down a few words that will help you recollect this definition, and then read the rest. But if you have time, then you can write something down about the rest of the information. Now we're going to listen to the lecture now, and I'm going to stop the lecture in between to kind of explain to you some of the important points.
Now listen to part of a lecture about this topic in a sociology class.
This is a true story from my own life. In my first year in high school, I was addicted to video games. I played them all the time, and I wasn't studying enough. I was failing chemistry. That was my hardest class. So this was a conflict for me because I wanted a good job when I grew up, and I knew that if you want a good career, you got to do well in school. But I just couldn't give up video games.
So here he already has said that this was a conflict for me, and we know that this is, the mental discomfort, the cognitive dissonance is basically a conflict between what we think we should be doing but what we are actually doing. So he has already introduced the problem that he was facing.
I was completely torn, and my solution was to change my perspective. See, the only class I was doing really badly in was chemistry. In the others, I was okay. So I asked myself if I wanted to be a chemist when I grew up. And the fact is, I didn't. I was pretty sure I wanted to be a sociologist. So I told myself my chemistry class didn't matter, because sociologists don't really need to know chemistry. In other words, I changed my understanding of what it meant to do well in school. I reinterpreted my situation. I used to think that doing well in school meant doing well in all my classes. But now I decided that succeeding in school meant only doing well in the classes that related directly to my future career. I eliminated the conflict, at least in my mind.
Using the example discussed by the professor, explain what cognitive dissonance is and how people often deal with it. Begin to prepare.
Okay, so now here in this question, in this lecture, he only gave one example. Okay, he did not give us two examples about the term cognitive dissonance. He just gave one example, but kind of presented in a way that, okay, this was the problem I was facing and this is how I dealt with it, which is kind of mirroring what we read in the reading passage, which is that what is cognitive dissonance a problem, and then remember how they talked about that, how do people often deal with it. So I think you should be able to now see that how the reading and the lecture are kind of structured in the same way, and they mirror the information, and what does the integration look like of the two sources. Now this is an answer template that you can follow to answer the question. You can start by saying the reading passage talks about the subject. The subject in this case is cognitive dissonance. So the reading passage talks about cognitive dissonance, which is, or you can say subject, in this case cognitive dissonance, or cognitive dissonance as we understand from the reading is, and then you will say what. Now note here that I'm not using the words such as defined as. If you have been preparing for a TOEFL for some time now, you might know that a lot of templates talk about starting by saying the reading passage defines cognitive dissonance as, or defines something as. I don't like using word defined as, because I find that the word defined as is very academic, and that's not what TOEFL speaking is about. Especially if you are targeting a 26 plus, you need to sound very natural on the speaking. Okay, so the way I like to explain to my students is that think about TOEFL speaking as speaking, a conversation that you're having with a friend in a coffee shop. Whereas TOEFL writing is more formal, but TOEFL speaking is informal. So I just don't like the word defined as, because I feel it's very formal and it doesn't fit with the TOEFL speaking. Then you're going to transition, okay, by saying something like, the professor provided an example from his personal life to explain this concept. Or you can say, the professor gives an example from his personal life to illustrate this concept. So, you can use your own sentences, but these are like good sentences to kind of inspire you to say something. It's not, you don't have to say provided because I wrote provided here. Just say gives, and it's totally fine. But you can use this sentence to kind of transition into your example. Now, here in my template, I have first example listed, and then I have second example listed. Remember, in this question, there was only one example, so we're going to be spending a lot of time explaining just one example. But usually there are also two examples on question number 3. So you will then use this. You will say first, you have to talk about first example, and you can start by saying first, he says that, or you can just say he talks about. Second, you can say second, he says that, but I recommend you use words such as furthermore, he says that, right? Rather than just saying second, first, furthermore, in addition. Those transition words look better. Now, it's really important that you understand how much time you need to spend on each of these parts of the question, because a lot of people end up spending too much time about the first example and they're not able to finish the question on time. They're not able to give enough information about the second example, and then they don't get a 26 because they haven't done enough topic development. And we will talk about topic development at the end today. So I want to give you the time management so that you know exactly how much time you need to spend on each of these parts. So first, your introduction needs to be approximately 10 seconds long, where you're talking about, what is the definition? What is kind of cognitive dissonance? Then, in order to transition into the examples, you can, the line that you're going to say, the professor provided an example from his personal life to illustrate this concept, that takes approximately 5 seconds. So you can think about that the introduction and the transition, like these two parts, in total combined take approximately 15 seconds. Then we're going to talk about the first example, and here the first example you're going to spend 20 to 25 seconds, and then you're going to spend the same amount of time on the second example. Now the thing is that sometimes what happens is that the question itself will talk a lot about the first example and not much about the second example. So in that case, obviously you're going to spend more time on the first example, and that's why I have a range here. So if obviously the question has a lot more information about the first example, you're going to end up on the higher range of this, which is 25 seconds. So now let's do this question. Okay, let's listen to my response on this question, and then let's see what are some of the things I did, and you can do the same. So I'm going to play the audio. The reading passage talks about cognitive dissonance, which is the mental discomfort between our actions and our beliefs about what we should be doing. So here I just did that introduction, okay? The professor provided his own example to illustrate the concept and talked about how he dealt with cognitive dissonance in his own life. He says that when he was in... So as you can see here, like this was my transition line. The professor provided his own example to illustrate the concept. I did not even say like, for example, he says that. No, I made it like, I didn't even say for example, or I didn't say like first, he says that. I just said he says that when he was in high school. And that's what I mean by, using the template but making it really kind of part of your vocabulary and making it sound natural. So like I used some parts of my template, but then I didn't say first. I just went very natural and just said he says that. That's it. In school, he was addicted to playing video games and he was failing his chemistry class. He knew that wasn't the right thing to do, but instead of changing his action and quitting playing video games, he decided to change his perspective on what he believed it is to do well in school. Okay, here I actually focused a little bit on, like I stressed my words on, but instead of, it changed his perspective. So I kind of stressed on these words because if you remember, the changing perspective was, how the reading also said that people deal with cognitive dissonance. So a lot of students face the problem with intonation. And what does intonation really mean? So English is not a monotonous language, and it's not like just a plain like same rhythm language. It has its own rhythm. It has its high pitch, low pitch. We stress on few words, whereas we don't stress on few words. Some words are longer than the other. So it's like a melody, right? So you really have to make sure that you understand the intonation patterns of the English language, and you talk and follow those rules, right? So what I did, I stress on few words to kind of make sure that the listener will understand my message. So by kind of focusing on change his perspective, I try to make my grader understand that, this is what's linked to the reading passage. Because if you remember, reading passage said this is how they changed their interpretation of the situation. So in order to kind of show the combination between the two sources, I choose to stress on these words.
He said that he doesn't actually need to pass the chemistry class because he doesn't want to be a chemist in the future.
So here too, when I say because he doesn't want to be a chemist in the future, you can see doesn't want to be a chemist in the future. There's like an up and down in the language.
That's how he kind of dealt with cognitive dissonance and the mental discomfort by really changing his perception rather than changing his action.
Right? So I want to focus on the something called the combining of the information. Like at the end, he said that he doesn't actually need to pass the chemistry class because he doesn't want to be a chemist in the future. Then I said, kind of wrapping up. So that's how he kind of dealt with cognitive dissonance. And I said, kind of dealt with cognitive dissonance because, I'm speaking naturally, and that's how I would speak to a friend. That's how he kind of dealt with cognitive dissonance. It just comes naturally to me like that. And the mental discomfort by really changing his perception rather than changing his action. So this is how I kind of combine this with what we read here. We read here that people change their perception rather than changing their action. See, people experiencing cognitive dissonance do not want to change the way they are acting. And that's how the professor also, he didn't want to play quitting video games, but rather he said, I don't need the chemistry class. So it's my job to make sure that the grader understands that I understood how the reading and the listening were kind of linked together. Okay, so I want to now give you a little bit more tips on question number 3. So question number 3 is, I think, the most difficult question for most of the students. And the reason is a lot of students face problem with time management. They start summarizing the examples rather than really showing the grader they understood the link between reading and listening. It's funny when we are answering any other question on some other exam, we read the question and we answer the question. But on TOEFL, we start summarizing what we just heard rather than answering the question and giving only the information that we need to give. So make sure that you're really reading the question and answering the question and not just summarizing it. So that's your strategic note-taking is extremely important on this question. You need to know what to take down in your notes so that you can say the information that you need to give. Now, do not memorize the template. Sound natural. We already discussed that. Now, make sure to spend approximately the same amount of time on both the first and second examples. So we already discussed that this as well, that a lot of students have that time management issue. They will start talking about the first example and they won't stop until it's like 10 seconds left, and then they'll start talking about the second example and they won't be able to cover everything about the second example. So you need to make sure that you give equal time to both of these. So now that you know the time management, I really want you to kind of use it in your practice sessions, because just kind of reading it here is not going to help you. You have to time yourself and you have to practice by making sure that you follow this timeline. The last one talks about the integration, which we already talked about, right? So there's no need to give an example, there's no need to give a conclusion at the end that says that this is the example that the professor gives to illustrate the concept. No, that's not going to do it if you need a 26. Really tell that this is how professor dealt with cognitive dissonance, by changing his perception rather than changing his action. Give a high level type of conclusion, which is not even like a basic conclusion. It's actually giving, doing topic development and showing the graders that you understand the material. Okay, so now we've discussed a lot about question number 4. I've given you a template that you can use. Now you know the time management and you have heard my response. And in this question, there was only one example. So I elaborated on just one example, but still you saw how I used intonation patterns and stressed some words to kind of convey my message in a better way. Then I gave you some additional tips for this question. And now we're going to talk about what will get you a 26 plus. Okay, so now a lot of foreign professionals need this score in order to get their professional license in the US. So it's important to remember that when you are targeting this score, you're really targeting a score that a native English speaker would get if they were to take the TOEFL exam. So if you have, not been able to get this score for a few times, don't feel disheartened. It is a really high score. So just make sure you know what's going on wrong with your speech, and make sure you really work on those errors, but don't feel disheartened. It is a really high score that you need to get. So let's talk about these categories. So these are the 3 categories that ETS is grading you on. First is topic development, then delivery, and third is language use. Now within these categories, there are a lot of different things. And today, for the time's sake, we're only going to cover one thing under each of these categories. So under topic development, I'm going to cover 2 C's. 2 C's stands for completeness and correctness. So what does that mean for question number 3? For question number 3, it means that you need to completely give the information. You need to give the information that will answer the question, and you need to make sure that you give information about both the first example and the second example. So not just talk about one example more than the other. And of course, the information that you're giving, it needs to be correct, right? So obviously, if you misunderstand the information and you give the wrong information in your response, you're not going to get a 26, because that shows that you don't understand the professor, and that's not going to get you a 26. So obviously, the information that you're giving needs to be correct. That's just goes without saying. Now, under delivery, there's a lot of different things. That's where your intonation, pronunciation, your stressing on few words, your fluency, and your clarity, if you are coherent with your responses, all that falls under delivery. And today we're going to just talk about fluency. Now, within fluency also, there are a lot of things that goes under fluency, but we're going to talk about filler words. Filler words are words such as the, like, these are the words that are filler words, and people do this mistake a lot. Okay, when we're nervous, we tend to say these words. So the most common question I get is that how many filler words can I make how many times can I have the in a response, and what to do if I'm having this issue. So the thing here is that if you have a perfect response, but you have like the or the pauses like once or twice in a response, that's going to be okay. Because the or having those unwanted pauses is sometimes just natural, and a lot of native speakers do as well. So if you have just that in a response and once or twice, and you don't have any other errors, it's going to be okay. But the reality is that there's just so much that goes on this section that I think if you're making this filler words errors, you need to kind of correct that as well. So the best way to correct is to kind of practice a lot and make sure when you're practicing, and if you're making filler words, rather than saying the word itself like the, first swap that the with just like keeping quiet for that moment. So rather than saying the, all those, just keep quiet. That's the first step. Okay, and then once you have now started keeping quiet and you're not making those words and noises, now you can fill that word, fill that pause with actual content, and you can start becoming more fluent. Under language use, there is grammar and there's advanced vocabulary. So we all know that if you use advanced vocabulary words, you're going to score better. But today we're going to just cover grammar. Like how many grammar errors can you make in a response? So now again, if your response is perfect and you made like one very small grammar error, such as, you know, instead of saying computers, you said computer, or like some very small error that doesn't really change the meaning of your sentence, you will be okay, right? Because it was only one, everything else was good. You might have had a slip of tongue, it's okay. But what happens is when you start making a lot of grammatical errors, what that does is that changes the meaning of your sentence, and then the listener cannot understand really what you're saying, or they will understand wrong information because you might use past tense in place of present tense or something like that. So make sure that your spoken grammar is really, really strong. And honestly, I think grammar is a part which is going to help you in the TOEFL writing section as well. So it's something that you need to really have a strong grammar if you want a high score on the TOEFL. Okay, so let me just see my notes to make sure that I covered everything with you today. Okay, yeah, so I covered everything that I wanted to cover. So I'm going to just wrap up this slide by saying that if you need a 26 plus, remember these are the 3 things they're grading you on, and it is kind of listed in the speaking rubric that they have provided. So you can always look at that. Under topic development, make sure you completely and correctly give the information, and give the information that will answer the question, not just summarize the information. And then within delivery, you need to be fluent, and you can't have too many filler words, because if you have too many filler words and you stop at unnecessary places, then it will be really hard for the person to understand you. Under language use is advanced vocabulary and grammar. So if you are making like one grammatical error and other than that you have no problem in your response, you're going to be fine. But the problem really happens when people make a lot of grammatical errors, especially with the tenses, and that changes the meaning of your sentence. So that's going to really stop you from getting that 26. So now we're done with this training. Now you know how to answer this question, what's a template that you can use, how much time you need to spend, and what are some of the things you can do with your intonation pattern, and what are some of the things that you need to do so that you answer this question at a very high grade level. So if you want more trainings on how to get a 26 on the speaking section, you can visit my website, theenglishtestsolution.com. Thank you, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.